Good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Collier. I'm the Executive Director of Renew Theaters, and I want to thank you for joining us for this Film 101 discussion of Sunset Boulevard, one of my top 5 films of all time. Really excited to be digging into this one. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I'm just really excited to see so many of you coming back to all of these. And as a reminder, Hannah will be doing one of these events once a month this year. So we are really excited to have her leading us through these films. And I know that she is going to be announcing our May title shortly. But let me just get the basics out of the way. And then I'll turn things over. So as always, this program is sponsored by the Vesta Fund. We thank them for their support of allowing us to do educational programs like these and allowing us to make them free to our members. Thank you all to all of our members who participate in these events. The theater really would not have made it this past year without your support. And we look forward to having you back in the building when we do reopen. I do also want to welcome everyone from all 4 of our theaters because these programs are virtual. It's really fun to bring everyone together from each of the different communities and the theaters that we have, and also outside. I see some faces that are not immediately here in the Philadelphia area, and it's really great to have you all part of this as well. Just a quick reminder of our Zoom protocols. Because there are a lot of us, we invite you all to stay on mute. For the beginning of this, Hannah is going to do a talk in the beginning, and then we will open things up to Q&A. We will actually be asking you to use the raise hand feature and then calling on you for the Q&A. And we'll see how things go. And maybe we might be able to open things up a little, but that's the way we're going to start. And I do have to step out for a little bit, so I want to introduce you. Some of you may know Brendan Joyce, one of our Renew staff, our programmer. You may have seen him doing many of our filmmaker Q&As, and he has done a Film 101 in the past, and he will help me moderate the Q&A. Brendan, do you want to say hi?
Hey everybody, glad to be here tonight.
All right. So as always, the chat will also be open. We will be, again, calling on people for the Q&A, but please feel free to use the chat. It is a great place for sidebar conversations to dig deeper in some of the things that are talking about, share some personal jokes or favorite moments. And we'll be monitoring the chat too and pulling some of the things that bubble up there into the conversation. So without further ado, I'm happy to turn things over to Hannah Jack. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are so happy to have this ongoing series with Hannah. She is a writer for Turner Classic Movies and has scripted introductions that have been delivered on air by the TCM hosts. She has also written introductions for HBO Max, Filmstruck, and the classic movies that have appeared on the TCM Fathom Events Big Screen series. She is a return to Doylestown after a Doylestown native who has returned, and we're so happy to have her back in the community and leading us through these. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to you, Hannah, and to talk about what our next film is and to lead us through the discussion on this one.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. I am so excited to talk about this movie and hear what you thought about it. So just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. We're good? Okay, awesome. So as Chris said, I'm not going to mention the movie at the next month at the end. I'm going to mention it up front here, what we're going to talk about next month, so that we don't accidentally forget to mention it. So next month, we're actually going to meet on a Wednesday instead of a Tuesday. It's Wednesday, May 12th. And I like to, as a writer for TCM, and I know there are a lot of TCM viewers in the crowd, I like to do a tie-in between what we're talking about, the movie that we're talking about, and what's airing on the network whenever possible, because I think it just adds to our knowledge base and makes for more interesting points of reference. And so this month, Sunset Boulevard is tying into TCM's 31 Days of Oscar program, which I'll talk about in a moment. But next month, May 12th is going to come right on the heels of the weekend that will be the virtual 2021 TCM Classic Film Festival. This is something that has traditionally taken place in LA, but because of COVID last year was moved to a virtual platform. And this year they've had obviously more time to make it a super robust virtual film festival. So it's going to be pretty incredible. There are going to be all kinds of celebrity special guests introducing movies on the network, some highlights from festivals in years past, great movies that have been curated with all sorts of themes. And that will be airing on Classic Movies from Thursday, May 6th, I believe is Thursday, until Sunday, May 9th. So if you have TCM, that's really a great time to tune in. If you don't, there's a bonus this year, which has never happened before, which is that they're curating a parallel festival to stream on HBO Max. So that is also going to be a TCM curated classic film festival with hosted introductions. And I think I wrote all of those introductions. I definitely wrote a lot that will be on the network, but I wrote a lot for the HBO Max festival as well. So I can tell you that there's going to be a lot of great movie availability in May. Leading into that, I wish I could pick a title and say, oh, this is one of the ones that's going to be at the festival. I can't, because I can't actually tell you what the lineup is yet, because they haven't announced it, and it's also being tweaked as we get closer. So even if I did choose a title that's going to be one of the festival titles, it might not be when all is said and done. But I am going to still do a little bit of a tie-in, which is to say that in the TCM festival, they always present what TCM calls discoveries, which are lesser known movies that are real gems that you may have seen, but you may never have come across before. And this one that I've chosen for next month is one of those that I would call a discovery. It's also a movie that people have discovered at the TCM festival because it has been screened at the festival in the past. So it is from 1943, The Oxbow Incident. This is a movie that if you know it, you know why I'm choosing it. It is a total powerhouse film that has a lot of relevance today, and I think we can have a great discussion about it. If you don't know it, a little bit of context, it is a Western. If you don't like Westerns, you'll like this one. It is a super powerful drama that unfolds like a stage play almost. And if you do like Westerns, you'll really like it. But the cast is led by Henry Fonda and Dana Andrews. It has an incredible ensemble of familiar faces. So that's from 1943, The Oxbow Incident. That's next month. I know for sure that it's available to stream if you have a Hulu subscription. It's also available to rent on a lot of platforms. So table that one. That's if you haven't seen it before, definitely check it out. And I hope you'll join us next month. But for right now, we have a really amazing film to discuss, and that is Sunset Boulevard. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And I have some images as I'm talking. This is the fun technical part. Here we go. And okay. So you should see Gloria Swanson. Yes? Okay. All right. So Sunset Boulevard, I mentioned, ties into TCM this month because on April 25th is the Academy Awards ceremony. And every year when it's Oscars month, TCM does 31 Days of Oscar, which is exactly what it sounds like. 31 days. It began April 1st of nonstop, 24/7. Only Oscar winners and nominees from years past are airing on the network. So if you haven't tuned into TCM yet this month, we're right in the middle of it, and the titles have been organized alphabetically this month. But Sunset Boulevard is a really important, it's from a really interesting Oscars year, and it was a major Oscars contender in 1950. It's also a very quintessentially Hollywood film about Hollywood. It's often considered the definitive Hollywood picture about Hollywood, and it's certainly not a pretty picture of Hollywood, right? It's a pretty scathing portrayal, and given its jabs at the industry, it's kind of shocking how much this movie was embraced by the industry when it premiered in 1950. And like I said, so embraced that it became one of the biggest Oscar contenders for 1950. It's also been ranked as one of the greatest films of all time. I think AFI listed it as like the 12th best movie made in America. And it's definitely one of the best film noirs. And this was a movie that was made by a man who helped to invent the genre of film noir in 1944 with the movie Double Indemnity. And that's the director, Billy Wilder, writer-director Billy Wilder, who wrote and directed Double Indemnity, and then a few years later gave us Sunset Boulevard, another just quintessential noir. So here's Billy Wilder on the left, and this is the man he wrote this movie with. Charles Brackett is on the right. And Charles Brackett was Billy Wilder's most important collaborator in the first half of his career. They started out as a screenwriting team together in the late 1930s, writing movies that were directed by other directors like Ernst Lubitsch. And then they evolved into this partnership where they wrote the screenplays together, and Billy Wilder directed and Charles Brackett produced. And they were an incredibly successful partnership, but it's very strange because they were kind of an odd couple. There couldn't have been two more different men working so collaboratively and productively together. Charles Brackett was this like blue blood American who traced his lineage back to like his wife's lineage was back to the Mayflower. His was shortly after that. He was a Harvard Law graduate. He was just a really sophisticated guy. And Billy Wilder was this caustic, acerbic, Austrian Jewish immigrant who had this biting wit. And so their personalities and their backgrounds were totally opposite. But they had this incredible partnership that produced some incredible films. And here are a few of them. This is from the first kind of half of Billy Wilder's career. Movies like A Foreign Affair, The Major and the Minor. They co-wrote Ninotchka, the famous Greta Garbo comedy that was directed by Ernst Lubitsch, but this was a Brackett and Wilder collaboration. The Lost Weekend, these were some of their movies. Now, if you're more familiar with Billy Wilder's later movies, you know that later he had a second chapter of his career where he had another really important writing partner who was IAL Diamond, and they together wrote movies like Some Like It Hot and The Apartment. But his first partner was Charles Brackett. Sunset Boulevard was the last movie that Brackett and Wilder ever made together. They went their separate ways after this and never reunited. And they didn't have any kind of falling out. They just were, their relationship was always tempestuous, and this is where it ended. But it ended on a pretty high note. Legend has it that the origins of the idea for Sunset Boulevard happened when Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder were out to lunch with a studio executive. And there was an old man at another table who was putting up a fuss, and the maitre d' or whoever had to escort him out of the restaurant. And the man, as he's leaving, says, "Do you have no idea who I am? I built this town." And they thought he was crazy, and they kicked him out of the restaurant. And the studio executive turned to Wilder and Brackett and said, "You know who that was? That was D.W. Griffith." And it's not an exaggeration to say D.W. Griffith did essentially build Hollywood for what we know it. He was the pioneering director in the early days of the silent era, director of Birth of a Nation, Intolerance, the movies that made cinema look like what it still does look like. He unlocked the possibilities. And it was D.W. Griffith's success that made Hollywood the epicenter of movie making. And yet he had been reduced to this forgotten, crazy state. And that's how Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett saw him in that moment. And it stuck with them that there was a movie here about some kind of titan of the early days of Hollywood who had been reduced to such a terrible state of being forgotten. And so it was a stroke of genius, really, that they decided ultimately to change that figure from a man to a woman. And they got help from a writer who's the third writer credited on this film, D.M. Marshman Jr. He had written for Life magazine, and they brought him in because he had these great ideas, which included that you needed someone who was younger and contemporary to star in the film. And he came up with the idea of the Joe character. And so the idea built into this other kind of, it morphed with working on it together. Now, Gloria Swanson was not the first one who was considered for the role of Norma Desmond. Initially, Mae West was considered, and she was you know, she was not a silent screen star, but she was a star of a bygone era. And she hated the idea of playing someone who was considered faded and past her prime. So she turned that down. But there were other silent movie legends who were considered. Mary Pickford is there in the middle, and she actually was married to a much younger man. So that kind of jived with her real life. And Pola Negri. And in every case, it just didn't, they either turned it down or didn't jive with Billy Wilder. And it was ultimately the director George Cukor who suggested Gloria Swanson, because there were so many parallels with her real life. Swanson liked the idea. She liked the idea when it was pitched to her, did not like the idea that she had to audition for this role. But her audition went so exceptionally that Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett were stunned and decided to build up the character of Norma Desmond to be a lead on equal footing with the Joe Gillis character. And it was because, and I think, I mean, we can all agree probably that it's Gloria Swanson's performance that makes this movie so much what it is. And that has a lot to do with the fact that, like I said, there was a lot of authenticity to the parallels between her character and her life and Norma Desmond. Gloria Swanson was a titan of the silent era. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say she was one of the biggest Hollywood stars in the days of silent film. She started out like Norma Desmond in front of the cameras when she was just a teenager. In fact, there's that scene where she's putting on a show for Joe, where she's twirling the umbrella and being a Mack Sennett bathing beauty. This was a character type that was very popular in these short films in the early days of silent movies. And Gloria Swanson, produced by the producer Mack Sennett, and Gloria Swanson started out working for producer Mack Sennett in these short films. That was authentic. She also worked at Paramount at the beginning of her career. That was her studio. And yet she was not just a silent star, she was also a producer, a really pioneering female filmmaker who helmed a lot of her own productions later in the 1920s and went on to earn 2 Academy Award nominations in the first 2 years of the Academy Awards. She was up for Best Actress in the first year the Academy Awards ever existed. And she also, like another huge parallel is that she made 6 films with director Cecil B. DeMille. So there was a lot that was very much part of her, part of Norma Desmond that was part of Gloria Swanson. We can talk about where the parallels end, but what you see in these 2 pictures is on the left-hand side, I hope you recognize him, that's Erich von Stroheim, who plays Max on the left with Gloria Swanson back in the silent era. And then on the right, there's Gloria Swanson in a movie with Rudolph Valentino, who's so centrally mentioned in this movie over and over again. And they were friends and co-stars. Now for the role of Joe Gillis, like similarly, William Holden was not the first choice. First choice, who actually got the part, was Montgomery Clift. And Montgomery Clift was at the very beginning of his career, and he backed out of the production before he started, because he thought that his career would be over before it even got out of the gate if he was seen making love to an older woman on screen. He thought that that was just poison to his career. And so he decided to bow out. Other actors who were briefly considered were Fred MacMurray, who was the star of Double Indemnity with Billy Wilder, as I mentioned. They tried to get Gene Kelly from MGM. And Marlon Brando was even considered, although he was untested in movies at this point. He was still just a stage star, really. And it was totally a stroke of luck for everyone that the part went to William Holden. William Holden, basically his qualifications were that he was there, he was under contract to Paramount, and he was cheap. He was not a big star, really. At this point, William Holden's career had started about a decade earlier. His first really credited role was this incredible beginning that looked very auspicious. He co-starred with Barbara Stanwyck in the movie Golden Boy back in 1939. But his career was very shortly thereafter interrupted by World War II, and he went off to fight in the war. And when he came back later in the 1940s, he was just cast in these very bland, boring, affable leading man types, and nobody really got to see that he had any acting potential. And Billy Wilder met with him to consider him for the role of Joe Gillis, and he saw that there was more to William Holden than audiences or Hollywood had seen. And thank goodness he saw that, because with this performance, it's no exaggeration to say this changed William Holden's career and gave us the William Holden that we know, which is to say that it changed his image on screen and showed that he had this power, this range, a darker, more cynical side. And the 1950s was an incredible, incredible decade for him after this movie, including a couple more movies with Billy Wilder. He went on to win the Oscar for Best Actor 3 years later for Stalag 17, which is a terrific prisoner of war drama directed by Billy Wilder and written by Billy Wilder. Also made Sabrina with Billy Wilder with Audrey Hepburn and Humphrey Bogart. Bridge on the River Kwai followed, and Picnic, and so many other great movies because of what Sunset Boulevard showed William Holden could do. And in addition to Holden and Swanson, so much I think of what makes this movie stand out are the realistic elements, these nods to real Hollywood history and real Hollywood people, so many of whom are in this movie. So here are a few of them. Up in the upper left-hand corner is Hedda Hopper, the legendary gossip columnist who plays herself in the movie, reporting from the bedroom of Norma Desmond at the end. That's her with Luella Parsons, who was, her rival. And then the waxworks, these forgotten silent relics are around the outside here. You have Buster Keaton, of course, in one of the great cameos in movie history. Anakin Nilsson was a silent Swedish film star. She plays herself in the movie like Buster Keaton. And H.B. Warner, who was the other waxwork around the bridge table, he did have a successful career as a character actor in talking pictures. You might have recognized him as Mr. Gower, the drugstore owner in It's a Wonderful Life. He went on to play a lot of memorable character roles, but in the silent era, he was a leading man. And there he is playing Jesus in King of Kings in 1927, directed by Cecil B. DeMille in the middle there. And Cecil B. DeMille plays himself in the movie. And the actually more than that, even when they visit the set that he's shooting on, he's shooting a real movie that he was making, because his career did not end with silent pictures. He was just as prolific in the sound era, and was making the movie Samson and Delilah in 1949, which is what we see when he's filming, when Norma goes to his set at Paramount. That was his soundstage. That's all real. And Samson and Delilah premiered just a few months before Sunset Boulevard. It was an even bigger hit than Sunset Boulevard. So these are all these realistic touches. And of course, we have to talk about Erich von Stroheim, who played Max. And he's maybe one of the most poignant, realistic aspects of this movie, because when he says that line, when he confesses that, in the early days, there were 3 young directors who showed promise: D.W. Griffith, Cecil B. DeMille, and Max von Mayerling. He really means Erich von Stroheim. He was one of the visionary directors of the silent era, this Austrian-born director, actor, producer. And he's best known for these just lavish, kind of over-the-top movies like silent pictures Greed, which is this legendary epic that was distorted, and all kinds of things to say about that. But because he was so excessive and difficult and over the top, he eventually got himself essentially banned from directing, and he had a successful second career as a character actor, including, as you see on the right there, in another Billy Wilder movie a few years earlier, 5 Grapes to Cairo. So he had worked with Billy Wilder before in the capacity as an actor. But on the left, you see him directing silent movies. And that moment where Norma is showing Joe one of her movies, where you see a young Gloria Swanson performing on the screen, that's really Gloria Swanson in a movie she really made, which was directed by Erich von Stroheim. It was a 1929 movie called Queen Kelly. And that film Gloria Swanson produced and fired Erich von Stroheim from. It was a huge debacle, and the movie was never released in the US, but it was really a stroke of genius. And it was Erich von Stroheim's idea to include that movie in that scene. So I mentioned before that I picked this movie because of the Oscars tie-in. So I just want to close by mentioning the Oscars really quickly. This is Billy Wilder with his abundance of Oscars later in his career. So Sunset Boulevard was one of the top contenders for Academy Awards in 1950. It won in 3 categories: for Best Screenplay, for its black and white art direction, and its score. I'm happy to talk about any of the people, the geniuses who worked behind the scenes on this film too, if you have questions about them. And it was nominated in all these other categories: for Best Picture, for William Holden as Best Actor. All 4 of the big of the major players in this movie got nominated: Holden, Gloria Swanson, Eric von Stroheim, who was insulted to be nominated in the supporting category, and Nancy Olson, who played Betty Schaefer. Billy Wilder for Best Director, the beautiful cinematography, and for its editing. And the reason why, I mean, when people talk about the 1950s Oscars, the key race that everyone kind of focuses in on is the Best Actress competition, because this was one of the most interesting years in that category. Gloria Swanson was up against these other women, 2 of them for the movie All About Eve, Anne Baxter and Bette Davis. All About Eve was the big Oscar contender in 1950, rivaling Sunset Boulevard. And interestingly, a very, very similar kind of story to Sunset Boulevard. Instead of taking its jabs at Hollywood, it is a scathing picture of the theater world, and also about an aging actress who's past her prime. And so Gloria Swanson and Bette Davis are often looked at as major contenders in this category for their performances in these films. The other contenders were Eleanor Parker for the movie Caged, about a women's prison, and Judy Holliday for the only comedy here, which was Born Yesterday. And yes, that's William Holden playing opposite her. So he starred opposite 2 of the Best Actress nominees that year. It's a good year for him. And the winner was Judy Holliday for the only comedy, for her comedy performance in Born Yesterday. And this is something that people still debate now. And so I'll leave it to you to decide who should have gotten that Best Actress award. So with that, I'm gonna pause and open it up to everybody. I would love to hear everything that you are thinking about this movie. I don't know what came in the chat, but. Brendan, I don't know, is Brendan here? Sorry.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions? Just use the raise hand feature or the chat, and Tom Wamser has a question. You have the floor, Tom.
Hi. I just wanted to say, first of all, what a great choice this was. Just a terrific film. One of the things that hadn't struck me, I'd seen it a number of times before, watched it again. But one of the things that struck me is, obviously it's about Hollywood, the way Hollywood uses people up and kind of, cast them aside. And then I hadn't thought of it. And then you mentioned that, they'd gotten the idea originally through D.W. Griffith, and then decided to cast a woman in the role. I was wondering if they thought specifically about, Hollywood has always been notorious, especially when it comes to actresses, for promoting them significantly, and then and then as they get older, pushing them aside. Male actors traditionally have had a much longer career, and I wonder if anybody at the time thought about that specifically, the gender aspect of it.
Yeah, they definitely had some inspiration in some real life figures. It was certainly the case that there were silent screen stars who were women, who Norma is kind of an amalgam of a lot of them, including Norma Talmadge, Mabel Normand. There were a number of women who kind of, the aspects of them formed that. the reality in the silent era was that because it was sound and not age that destroyed so many careers, it was kind of gender neutral in terms of whose careers suffered and whose didn't, because it was whether or not their style and their voices could be sustained in the sound era. I think that it was also D.M. Marshman Jr., the third writer that I mentioned, who had the idea of making this protagonist be a young man, and that kind of informed the relationship and who the silent star would be.
Thank you.
So we have a few questions coming in. So I'm just going to go to the order I saw them. Anne Avalon, you have the floor.
Hi, Hannah. I had one line that Cecil B. DeMille actually had in the movie that really stuck with me, and it was something to the effect of, "A dozen press agents working overtime can ruin the human spirit." And I really think that's just the essence of the whole movie, and it just stuck with me.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that the beginning of this movie is so iconic, as well as the ending, of course. And it's hard to imagine, it has so much dramatic power at the beginning. It's hard to imagine that actually Billy Wilder shot a whole separate opening scene, which took place in the morgue, in which William Holden is taken, in a hospital truck to the morgue, and there are all these cadavers laid out with toe tags, and they start discussing how they got there. And it wasn't until, and the movie took a long time to make, it was a full-blown, huge grade A production. It was a year and a half from the point they started writing till they were essentially finished and did a series of screen tests and realized how disastrous that beginning was.
Yeah.
The audiences laughed, and it sort of created the wrong tone. People thought it was like a slapstick comedy or something. And then they went back and reshot the beginning that we know with all the police coming, and with a voiceover, which is just so evocative. So it's just interesting that such an essential part of a classic movie almost didn't happen.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up that scene. It's such a bizarre, different tone that it set. It really set, and that's what Billy Wilder realized when he previewed that scene in the morgue with audiences, that it was just, people were laughing, and that's not how he wanted to set it up. He wanted to set up a cynical opening, and he definitely accomplished that by, changing that to be him in the pool instead. It's very Billy Wilder to open with, a voiceover. And so how to get that exactly right. If you look at a lot of Billy Wilder movies, they often open with voiceovers, but he does it differently from one film to the next, and who's narrating and what their perspective is. He played around with quite a bit.
So we have a question from the chat. This is from Elise. She's asking, can you discuss the character of William Holden?
Yes. In terms of Joe specifically, his character, what would you like to know about him?
Okay, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just thought he was so brilliantly ambivalent. You never really knew where he was going to land, and he didn't either, I don't think. He sends his co-screenwriter, his partner, away when she says, "Pack your bags, let's leave." He says no, and the next minute he's packing his bags. There was such self-loathing and such, I don't know, jaded cynicism. I just thought it was just beautifully rich.
Yeah, and that is what showed, that's what changed William Holden's career around. It's a very film noir trope to have this very, self-destructive male protagonist who wants to get his life together and just can't seem to get there. And so that's one of the things that makes this a noir. And it also is one of the things that became a quality of William Holden characters throughout the rest of at least the 50s. He often played these very cynical, self-destructive or self-loathing types in a lot of movies, and that was something that nobody had seen in him before. So again, it was a reason why he wasn't thought of first for this kind of role.
Brian Burker, you have the floor.
Yeah, one connection I made when I was watching the film this time was when Wilder was a young man trying to break into the Berlin film industry. He actually worked as a taxi dancer, which basically meant he was paid to dance with older women at events. And when he sold his first script, he quit the job because he found it demeaning to both him and the women. And that's really the Gillis character, the William Holden character is Wilder. He just makes the different choice until it's too late to back out.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. Yeah, that is one of Billy Wilder's early jobs, was as a taxi dancer. Yeah.
So we have a question from the chat from Susan. She says, I'm curious about the first person narration, especially since he dies at the end. Was that ever done before?
Was it done before? Yes. Off the top of my head, I can't remember when. If somebody can think of another example, that would be great. But yeah, it's that's one of those. It's pulled from the initial idea, which was to shoot this from the morgue, and they kept the idea that he was still narrating the story after he was dead.
Rise Cass, you said that you can find the raised hand emoji. So if you have a question, please.
Just unmute yourself.
Got it?
Yep.
Got it. Okay, it's pronounced Risa, but that's okay. My mother did that to me. So what I found really interesting was the conflict between the two women. I thought that added some richness to the conflict that he was having, and that the women then became part of this dynamic with one another. So I thought that was interesting. And I also have a comment about the first scene, that you don't really pay much attention to the fact, even though you know that he dies at the end, you go on to watch the movie without really worrying about it, thinking about it even. You're just, the movie's so compelling that it draws you right into the plot, and you almost, ignore that. So yeah. I thought that was an interesting part of it. Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
Sophia Garcia, you had your hand raised, so you have the floor.
Hi. So I wanted to talk about the chimpanzee. I thought it was really interesting, and it added to the whole death theme. But I was wondering if you knew anything else about it, or and about the purpose of it.
Yeah, it's to show how very, very lonely and strange Norma's life has become. That was an invention of Billy Wilder's, and also Eric von Stroheim added a lot of these strange elements. A lot of his suggestions kind of elaborated on how bizarre her life was and her dynamic with Max was. So those kinds of strange ideas, like Max writing the fan letters, all these weird little, just how sad and pathetic and lonely her life has become, came out of those. They started shooting this movie with only 61 pages of the script, which was not remotely a full script. So a lot of the ideas, a lot of the little quirks, especially, the strangest ones, came as they were going and were suggested by so many of the people who knew that era and were using people or weird experiences that they knew to inform it.
So we have a question from the chat. It's from Russell. He says, I would love to have you talk more about the role of the music in this movie. I think that played a central role.
Yes, Franz Waxman, who did win the Oscar for his score for this film, was a great composer who scored a lot of the great Hollywood films. And the score, I think he pulled from a lot of different elements. So Joe has this more jazzy motif that he has when he's on screen. You hear more of a jazzy score. Norma is much more inspired by a tango that harkens back to her Valentino, romantic side from the bygone era. I should also add that the costumes by the great Edith Head were designed to harken back. I mean, Norma's costumes specifically were designed to do a similar thing, where her costume was meant to pull from these over the top silent costumes, like what she would have worn on screen in the silent era, and also to have these hints of the present. So you're never quite sure what era she's living in. And that was a very specific design choice also. And Joe was supposed to obviously be in this much more contemporary look.
Meredith, you have your hand raised.
Yeah. I was just wondering, Hannah, if you could talk a little bit about the Haze Code and how, especially since this movie is a lot about sexuality and violence, and how that might have like influenced them and what they could and couldn't do in the film.
Yeah, they got a lot by the censors. It was a lot because it was suggested and not shown, and not explicitly said. I mean, you can also read this movie as you could. I mean, it's certainly hinted because Billy Wilder always pushed the boundaries, but you could be like, oh, she's just paying for his things. There's nothing like explicitly mentioned or shown on screen. This was classic Billy Wilder to push the envelope as much as possible with promiscuity and sexuality. His movies, his later part of his career was sex comedies later in the 50s and into the 60s when the censorship rules became more lax. But this was just at the beginning of that. And he didn't push the envelope as much as he could have. The other thing though, is that because it's a movie that really is negative about Hollywood, there could have been a lot of pushback. They kept it a real secret what they were working on as long as possible. And so the idea that got around Hollywood was just that this was a movie about a silent screen star. And so that kind of set the tone that was what they were working on. And so there wasn't a lot of flurry of concern about it. And in the end, they managed to get everything by there were not any of those legendary battles that you hear with the Haze office on other films. And in fact, Hollywood loved this movie. The only person who really hated it was Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, who chastised Billy Wilder when he saw the movie and really felt that Billy Wilder was kind of biting the hand that fed him in terms of the fact that they were immigrants who Hollywood had made, legends, and Hollywood did everything for them. And he felt that he was turning his back on the industry that had done so much for them.
Melissa from the chat asks, how would audiences at the time have viewed Joe Gillis, with sympathy or disgust at living off this woman?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm curious to know what all of you think in terms of how you viewed him today. It's hard to know what audiences at the time would have thought about that sort of thing, but I'd love to hear what you thought about their relationship.
The next hand I saw raised was Catherine. You have the floor.
Hi, thanks again, Hannah. I was taken by the screenplay, and even more so now, maybe, that you said they only have 60 pages when they started, so they must have been writing quite quickly on the fly. Anne mentioned one striking sort of thesis statement about the press agent stifling the human spirit. There were lines about wind wheezing through organs and wishing you could crawl into a hole and pull it over you. And at one point he said something about feeling like he was her cigarette contraption on her finger, and then you see her. I don't know, I just thought it was quite poetic and almost diaristic and even vulnerable. So any insight you have on the screenplay, the rhetorical inspiration for it would be appreciated. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, it was I think one of the reasons why this is such a great movie is because it's one of those movies where all the elements just come together and they work so beautifully. And it's because it was a very collaborative film. It's also Billy Wilder, if you haven't seen other Billy Wilder movies, I highly recommend his movies because they're always so pithy in that way. There is something so poetic in his writing. I mean, if you think about, the great last lines of movies of Some Like It Hot and, The Apartment, I mean, these were also invented on the fly as he was making these movies. And so he had he just had a wit to him that came up with so many of these things. But a lot of it was, I mean, a lot of the ideas were brought up as they went and were informed as, by the people like Eric von Stroheim who were making suggestions. Some of the stuff was real too, like Cecil B. DeMille really did call Gloria Swanson young fellow when they worked together. And, she really did call him Mr. DeMille. And so many of those aspects were from just the actual rapport as well.
Joseph from the chat asks, do you know if Norma's final line of the film is in the original script?
Yes, as far as I know, it was, yeah.
Anne, you have your hand raised? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna mention something about the monkey that Sophia was talking about. It reminded me of Michael Jackson with his monkey back in the day, similar tragic character, just very lonely.
Opulent lifestyle, yeah.
Yeah. But the other thing was that the amazing acting job that Gloria Swanson did, because she was so over the top and it was so, I think, so difficult she pushed it as far as she could without being, silly. And when you see her interviewed in real life, she has the most delicate voice and just gentle demeanor about herself. It truly, you could tell, like, that solidified what an incredible acting job she did in that.
I'm glad you brought that up because it is often, I mean, from the time Sunset Boulevard premiered, people assumed that Gloria Swanson was just like Norma Desmond, and that was absolutely untrue. I mean, she was not a crazy person. She was not someone who Hollywood had kicked to the curb. She was very much, the captain of her own ship and very sharp always. She made a successful transition to talking pictures. She earned an Oscar nomination for her first talkie and just went on to make a couple movies in the early 1930s that happened to not be hits. And so she, between that and some financial issues, she turned her back on Hollywood. She went to New York instead and had another successful career. I mean, she was really prolific on the radio, in theater, eventually on television. And, Sunset Boulevard gave people this image of her that she had been this forgotten. She was a major silent movie star who had this opulent, lavish lifestyle. I mean, millions of husbands and all these things, and she was in some ways like Norma Desmond, but personality-wise, not at all. Just as sharp as a tack. I do recommend watching some interviews with her because she really was just a funky, cool lady.
Yeah.
David, you had your hand raised. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I have to admit, Sunday was the first time I had ever seen Sunset Boulevard. My whole life I've been seeing send-ups and campy caricatures of it, and it wasn't that far off. I mean, when you watch her, it's like she's doing a send-up, and Anne touched on it, and you touched on it earlier, Hannah. So you might not be able to answer this, but how did people react to that performance, if you know? Like, you say it was generally accepted in Hollywood, but being so over the top and campy, couldn't it have easily been taken as comical?
Yeah, I think that it was a big hit, and so people did love it. I do know in Hollywood specifically, at one preview there, some silent movie stars were present, including Mary Pickford, who I mentioned. Mary Pickford was the biggest, silent movie star for a time, and she, after the movie, Gloria Swanson was told that Mary Pickford couldn't talk to her right then and there because she was just so overcome, because it just rang so true to her, that this was what, you know, it just felt real. And that was true of other silent people who had worked in the silent era, had a similar, just stunned by her performance reaction, that like she was bringing so much realism, even though it's over the top as it is. And contemporary people like Barbara Stanwyck apparently like knelt to the floor and kissed Gloria Swanson's feet, because she just, I mean, people were really wowed by her performance. And I think that for as over the top and campy as it is, I think it's also just a performance about, you know, it's a character who is so, you know, psychologically distraught. And so she is, you know, so desperate. But when we meet her, you know, she's just kind of closed off to the world. But Joe kind of brings out this promise that she could come back, and she could. And so like it, you know, awakens something in her, I think, that we do see. And I also think, I mean, if, you know, for those of us who've watched this movie over and over again, I think that the more we watch this movie, the more we can see nuances in her performance too, that that are there. Yeah.
Carolyn, looks like you're next.
Hi.
Hey.
I hope you, oh, okay, you can hear me. Two things. I was just gonna say that it probably rang true because I'm not someone in the business, but I would guess that people who saw this could see like the sacrifices that they made just to gain their success. Like Gloria Swanson or Norma Desmond doing everything she had to do to still remain attractive and relevant, and all of the, you know, the massages and the makeup and the whole regime she went through, and Joe sacrificing his soul basically to just live the way he wanted to live, but then he was hating himself for it because he knew that was not who he started out being. I'm sure that was recognized by a lot of people in the industry, like the steps that they had to take that they didn't think they were going to have to.
Yeah, absolutely. And to remember also that she's supposed to be 50. I mean, that's how old Norma is. And that's something to think about nowadays too, that, you know, and Gloria Swanson was actually 50 at the time when she made this. And Margot Channing, the Betty Davis character in All About Eve, is worried about being 40. And so, you know, and past her prime as an actress. And so that's something, you know, to think about, you know, how this movie resonates or doesn't today, in terms of that aspect of it.
Yeah. Oh, and I just had one other little
comment. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No, it's okay. A detail that I like, because I love Billy Wilder's movies, and he always has these little touches. And one thing that I loved about this movie was the wind wheezing through the organ. It wasn't the soundtrack per se, but it just added just such an uncomfortable tension to being in this house. And it just, you know, it's not a comedy, and they're just living with this. And it just puts everybody on, it's off-putting.
Yeah, I mean, that set in and of itself is something to talk about. Yeah, sure.
I have a question from the chat here, looking at the Betty Schaefer character as a representation of quote unquote new Hollywood, and asking, can you comment on what Wilder is saying in terms of the relationship between old Hollywood and new Hollywood, and sort of what fits in the script?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a cynical picture of new Hollywood in that time. I mean, the producer Joe is trying to meet with has ulcers all the time. He has no money to give to anybody. You know, he's like, everybody's just bitter. Every comment out of the mouths of the new Hollywood people is just something cynical, like, oh, what if we take this great idea and make it into a Betty Hutton musical? And like, you know, it's nothing has any kind of artistic merit anymore. And there's nothing, you know, everybody's just in it for a buck, and Joe just is going to type something to make, you know, a few dollars to pay for his car so it doesn't get, you know, towed. And it's just so cynical. And I think Betty is the idealist in all of this. She holds on to the idea that he has something good to write and something good to offer. And she's been in the business, you know, her family's been in the business. Nancy Olson is still alive. She was a guest at the TCM Film Festival a couple years ago, and is sharp as ever, and is really, really an interesting person.
do need to highlight that there is a fantastic fact that was also unearthed in the chat, in that Swanson's last film was Airport in 1975 and also featured Nancy Olson.
Yes, yes, good point.
Thank you to Tom for sharing that. And thank you to Carol Collier for the last question.
She also, Gloria Swanson did not choose to make a lot of, this was a great comeback, even though, Norma hates that word. She did, have a resurgence of popularity, obviously, because of this movie. But she turned down a lot of movie roles right after this because everyone just wanted her to play Norma Desmond types, and she didn't want to do that. So she didn't make a ton of movies after this. Yeah.
John Toner, you're next.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on your question about how audiences then or now respond to the characters. And even though both characters are incredibly flawed, she's, batshit crazy and he is ironic and sarcastic, but they're both so sympathetic. Her character is so earnest and committed to what she's doing, and then allows that vulnerability to show that it really, I think it's not over the top. She does push it right to the edge, but there's always that vulnerability and that neediness which she has, neediness for her public and neediness for Joe to love her, that really makes you, especially when you see it more than once, sympathetic. And he's much cooler and sarcastic and making commentary on things. But then when he submits to her in that great scene after she's attempted suicide, you can see that he's moved by her passion also. And he says, "You're the only person in this town who ever treated me well." And then she just reaches out and draws him in.
Right, yeah.
And I don't know about other people, but I was totally taken by the way she uses her hands. They're almost like talons, a bird of prey. And she just brings him into her, and he's ensnared and completely under her power at that point. And she's totally in charge.
Yeah. I mean, on that note, I should also mention, because we haven't yet, and it's worth mentioning, the cinematography in this movie is just exceptional. There's so many of the shots, I mean, especially on further watches, are just so beautifully composed. And that's how when you see her hands go, or you see, him lurking, or her in front of the projector with the, billowing in front of her. There's so much in the cinematography and even the opening shot of Joe in the pool. If you watch that opening shot, it tracks from the Sunset Boulevard on the pavement all the way to following the police cars, and then we get to the house, and then you see Joe in the pool. And that was a whole innovative thing, to shoot through the water tank at the studio so you could see the flash bulbs coming through. And the cinematography was nominated for an Oscar. I would ordinarily say that any movie going up against this maybe wouldn't win Sunset Boulevard should have won over it. Sunset Boulevard was up against The Third Man that year, which I think the cinematography for that, I concede should have won. But it's really, some of the camera work in this movie is excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, it was John Seitz, of course, who did Double Indemnity and did other things for Billy Wilder. Also shot some films for Preston Sturges too. So it was a great Paramount.
And his career went back to the silent era, and he shot some of the great Valentino movies. So he was another tie. A lot of the people behind the cameras were tied to the silent era too, informing, so much of what makes this authentic.
We will get to you in 1 second, Grant. There's two things in the comment that I want to loop back to items that were just discussed. First, Polly shares that the soft focus at the end of the last shot was actually a camera mistake, according to Wilder. So that is an interesting addition to the cinematography conversation. And there were also two questions that sort of tied onto what John was talking about in terms of the suicide attempt. And I just want to share those both and continue that thread, and then we'll come to you, Grant. The first is from Melissa, and it says, in stage productions that Melissa's seen, Norma's suicide attempts seem manipulative rather than real. Well, in the movie, it seems pretty real given Max's foreshadowing. What is your take on that? And then Russell adds, I found it interesting how Joe had escaped for a few minutes to the New Year's Eve party, but immediately answered the call of duty when he found out that Norma had made a suicide attempt. So do you want to comment any further on the suicide, and do you know how that was brought into the story?
Yeah, it's a daring thing to show and mention, especially in a movie of this era. Just for people who are on camera, how many people have seen the stage musical Sunset Boulevard? Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and Glenn Close is great if you've seen her in it. And it's definitely a lot of the over the top aspects of Sunset Boulevard come out more in the stage musical. It does feel like some of the moments are a little bit more, exaggerated by nature of the different medium. Yeah, I mean, the issue of suicide, of course, has been in movies since before Sunset Boulevard, but it really is part of this character and part of what makes Joe stay with her. So, yeah. Again, Billy Wilder pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable at the time.
Grant?
Hi, Hannah. I was just wondering if there were other actors that were up for it that might have not taken it because it's so anti Hollywood and anti-studio, it seems like.
Yeah. Yes, those women who I mentioned specifically. Mary Pickford was ready to do it. The other actresses were not, but Billy Wilder did not think that Mary Pickford would have let him be the director on the film. So she opted out. But
thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any questions? I see Joe. Joe, you unmuted yourself.
I did. Wilder, you can do an entire chat all night long just on Wilder. And I know you know a whole lot about Billy. Where did the cynicism come from? Because almost every one of his films, even his comedies, even The Fortune Cookie is cynical. Where did the cynicism come from? Because it started a little bit before Sunset Boulevard. Was it his upbringing in Europe, or where do you think it came from? Or is it all him and his partner, the writer?
Yeah.
Because it continues all the way up until, the end. Never stops.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely his personality. He was always a kind of caustic, kind of, cynical guy. That was his nature. You have to remember also that Billy Wilder did flee Europe because of the rise of Hitler. And so a lot of his picture of life was shaded by that. And he did start out in the German film industry, and a lot of what his work in that era, and then his having to, leave, created a kind of cynicism for him. And it just was his style. But it's also incredible, given his quintessential kind of European outlook on certain things and his style. He made some of the most American kind of movies and characters. And so he really helped to define what an American Hollywood picture could look like, even though he was an immigrant from, who did not come here speaking English at all. And so that was really something that was incredible about his career too, and his style.
John, I saw you had another question.
I was just filling in the silence. Sort of a fun fact about William Holden, which I just learned, which kind of highlights how Hollywood was different then than it is now. That William Holden and his wife were the best man and maid of honor for a famous Hollywood couple, and they were the only members of the wedding party. Ronnie Reagan and Nancy Davis. So you don't really see that type of individual in Hollywood these days.
Bob, I see your hand up. You've got the floor.
Yeah. I like these movies about Hollywood, in this case, I recently watched The Player, and, there's so many, I'm not an insider, I'll never be an insider, but you sort of feel like you're a little bit of an insider watching these movies. And it seems like Hollywood doesn't mind having a caustic, cynical view. I mean, the player was well received, and everybody wanted to be in the cameos, right?
Right. Yeah, and Sunset Boulevard really did open the floodgates for that, especially in the 1950s. There were a lot of movies, caustic movies about Hollywood that followed, including movies like The Bad and the Beautiful, like these films that really were just had a negative take on the industry. But that Billy Wilder opened the floodgates with this movie. Yeah.
Jack Beyer, I see you've come off mute. Did you have a question?
I have a comment based on John's description of Holden's being captured by Nora's intensity and the intensity of her love and need for him, and how he is captured by that despite his initial response for finding her initially so grotesque. Reminded me of a 1869 book novel called Fosca that was the basis for Ettore Scola's film Passione d'Amore, which then Stephen Sondheim used as the basis for his musical Passion. And there's great similarity, great parallels to the way John was describing this relationship to what goes on in that particular story.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Elise, I saw your hand up.
Yes, it was up. I was thinking about how Hollywood loves a movie about Hollywood, even if it's critical. And I was thinking about the movie Mank, which has been nominated for about 1 trillion Academy Awards, I think 11 really. And its appeal totally escaped me. I'm wondering, have there been a lot of movies about movie making? It seems so narcissistic on its face. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and they're always Hollywood Oscars contenders. I think that the Hollywood movies about Hollywood tend to be big Academy Award contenders. Yeah, there have been. I mean, it's come in phases, like everything else. I think there are bursts of this being something that a lot of people are taking up as a subject.
Well, just to say, in the past couple of years, if you had your money on The Artist or Argo, those are movies about Hollywood, and they keep coming around. Tom?
Yeah, just a quick comment and then a question. The comment is, I think it's great that you don't know whether the suicide attempts are real. You don't know. You certainly think she could fake them. On the other hand, I think there was a comment that they seem very real, and I love in the movie that you don't know. You aren't sure if she's just manipulating or if she really is getting that depressed, which makes total sense in when you consider her life. So I think that's a real strength of the movie. The other thing, Anna, if you could talk about that final scene where she's coming down the stairway and the stairway is filled, and I mean, it's like everyone becomes an extra in her film at that moment. It is an amazing shot as she comes down, both her acting and just the composition, everything about it. So.
Yeah, when Billy Wilder yelled cut and print it, that was it, that was essentially the last moment that they were shooting together. Also so happened she burst into tears and everyone applauded her, and it was this incredibly celebratory moment because she was so sad that it was over. It was just an incredible thing. She also, I heard at one point that because she knew she had to go down the spiral staircase on the narrow part, she made the choice to take her shoes off, so she didn't wear her heels. So that's why she's going barefoot down the steps there too. It's one of those incredible moments of just, like I mentioned before, all of the elements coming together just so perfectly. I don't know how much more time we have, Chris, for questions, but.
Yeah, this is actually is going on pretty long. Obviously, as I said in the beginning, there's a lot to discuss. I think we can probably take 1 or 2 more. Bob?
I thought it was great that that it was made at this time when the aging actress could be a silent film actress, and her contrast could be so. I mean, she's so melodramatic. She's got the claw hand. She's got the big eyes. You know, that if you made this movie today, I don't know how you could be any better than having those contrasts between the modern actor and the 50-year-old washed-up actress.
Yeah. No, and it's a stylistic difference too, of course, right? That she everything is so expressive with her face, and that's part of her character too, is that she's used to using her her physicality. That's what made her famous, was telling a story without words. So, you know, that's also part of what makes that character great. Yeah.
I see some people starting to jump off, but Daniel, I see your hand. We'll take this as the last question and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thanks so much, Hannah. I really appreciate all the insights y'all are giving to everyone. It was occurring to me just to mention something I noticed when I guess I don't know if it was the beginning or the end when the Paramount News was coming. It was like they had a kind of a shot of the Paramount News. And just like with, I guess, the writer, Joe Gillis, I guess, trying to go back to Dayton to, I guess, work in a newsroom, it seemed like a lot of kind of like mirroring, I don't know if reality TV is the right framing of it, but like kind of like an advent of like a merging of kind of like a disconnected star system to a more grounded kind of, I don't know, like a reality-based kind of media Hedda Hopper sensational kind of thing. I guess it was just in that last shot whenever she's walking past everyone kind of, and they're letting her play in her own world, and it kind of like, I don't know, like it kind of reminds me of like a 15 Minutes of Fame, Andy Warhol type kind of thing. And it's just like she's walking past everyone. I don't know. I don't know what there is to that, but I just figured I'd mention it as it was occurring to me. Just to
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's that voiceover narration that sets up the whole movie. Is you have to get the story straight. If you want to read about this version, you'll read about it in the tabloids in the, you know, tomorrow or later today. And this is what they'll say. This is how they'll couch it. But if you want the real story, here's the real story. So the whole film is set up to debunk what, you know, the public is going to say about it. And this idea that what you're hearing about Hollywood or about these people is not, you know, the truth of the people. And so he's, you know, kind of bringing us closer inside. So many meta layers to this. I mean, it's one of those films that you can keep peeling away at, but I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Hannah, for leading us through this conversation.
Thank you guys for coming. And I know that Sunset Boulevard is a more well-known movie, but again, if you haven't seen the Oxbow Incident or haven't even heard of it, definitely check it out, because that's one that will have some really interesting things to say about in terms of not just the movie, but in terms of what it has to say next month.